The killing has to stop. It absolutely has to. I don't believe that there is a military solution to the problems in that region. I am as convinced of it as I am convinced of anything. There's only a diplomatic solution. And as we have seen, the waging of war, if we can call it that, because of course these are not at all equal sides in terms of resources and power, but the continual waging of war by Israel on Gaza has led to tens of thousands of deaths, is only going to lead to more, and has, as we have seen, has only endangered the hostages.
Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Welcome back, friends. This is part 2 of the conversation that I had with Rabbi Salem Pearce. If you were just tuning in and you did not get a chance to listen to part 1 that was released on Sunday, September 8th, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode first, as it gives you a great chance to get to know Rabbi Salem, as well as to understand some of the core teachings of Judaism. I chose to break this conversation into 2 episodes because it was a rich, meaningful, deep, and important conversation, and I didn't want to cut it short. But I specifically wanted to give this part of the conversation that you are about to hear, in which we talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, its own sacred space because of how essential and emotional this issue is, politically, spiritually, and ethically. I want to remind you that this conversation was recorded on September 2nd, less than 24 hours after 6 Israeli and Israeli-American hostages that had survived over 300 days in captivity were killed, and their bodies were recovered. In the same day, 47 Palestinians were killed in an airstrike. In this tender and challenging time, I am so grateful that Rabbi Salem chose to join me to have this conversation. She was unsure if it would feel okay. Because it was such a tender time, we gave ourselves the opportunity to have an out if we needed it, but we made our way through and made space for all that came up. And I am so grateful for what she has shared with me and with all of you here in this conversation. I know that this can be a tender and challenging topic for Jews, Palestinians, and all humans alike. But I think it is our responsibility as humans to look at the hard stuff, to stand up for what we believe in, to stand up for others, and to take care of one another. So I really hope that you will listen to this whole episode and, of course, take care of yourself as you listen and afterwards. The conflict between Israel and Palestine. I know that this is a very tender moment for all Jews, for all people, for anybody who is connected to this conflict in any capacity, whether they have a connection to it in faith or nationality or not at all. And so I want us, Salem, to talk about Gaza and what is happening with the Israeli state. And I just want to open the floor to you right now because I know this is a tender topic, especially in this tender moment.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that introduction. And I'll say, yes, I'm coming here with a very tender heart today for a couple of reasons. The most immediate is that the world got the news yesterday that 6 hostages who had survived 300 plus days in captivity in Gaza were killed. And their bodies recovered, and today was the funeral of one particular hostage, Hirsch Goldberg-Pollen, whose parents are Israeli-American, who spoke at the DNC a couple weeks ago and have been very outspoken in their efforts to get Netanyahu's government to make a deal and return the hostages. Everyone in the American Jewish community, 1, 2, 3 degrees separated from these hostages. And that's really what's, I think, can be hard to understand. One of my friends is a cousin of the Goldberg-Pollens. People I know have studied with Hirsch, knew him. So I want to underline, that's true for practically all of the hostages, that the Jewish community is that small that most of us are just degrees away. And it has been a heart-wrenching time, partly because, right, these hostages were alive recently, very recently, as far as we know, and were killed instead of being rescued or returned in a deal, which the Netanyahu government has refused. And we know as recently as a few weeks ago, there were deal talks, has refused to engage in, and instead has decided to wage war, killing what we know is at least 40,000 Palestinians in Gaza, probably so many more over these past 10 or 11 months. So I am here today, heartbroken and furious. I'm heartbroken at the 6 hostages that are now dead. And I should just say, 47 Palestinians were killed yesterday in an airstrike, and they were equally as precious as those 6 hostages. And it has been heartbreaking for me also to see the Jewish community so upset about these 6 hostages. And I understand, as I want to be clear, that I understand the reasons why, but the 40,000 Gazans who have died have equal claim on our compassion and our heartbreak, because each one of them, as we say in Jewish tradition, was a world into itself. And it is hard for me to see what I think is an unintentional but very real valuing of some lives over others. And what is clear to me is that the people in charge, right, the people who have the power, don't care about Israelis and Palestinians. And I say that, blanket statement, and I feel pretty comfortable saying that about Hamas and about the current Israeli government, that they just don't care, because Hamas certainly knew that what was going to happen, provoked this particular round of attacks with the atrocities of October 7th, and knew that Israel would overreact and disproportionately kill. And that was okay with the leadership of Gaza. And Israel did exactly what it always does, which is disproportionately kill and punish innocent people, civilians. So what I care about are the people, in the land, but let's just say for now, Israelis and Palestinians. None of them are going anywhere. Anyone who says differently is delusional or genocidal. And they all have to be able to live in equality and safety. And it feels very clear to me that current leadership on both sides don't subscribe to that very simple notion.
Right. I want to thank you for sharing how you feel, how you are feeling currently, and the heartbreak and heart sickness that you feel around the loss of lives, of all the lives, and that every Palestinian life is equally deserving of our compassion and attention as every Israeli life and any life in general, which I also believe. And so I really appreciate you speaking up about that and sharing your heart with us here. And I'm also sorry for the loss of someone that you had less degrees connected to, right? And I think that is one of the things that is interesting, is that when something hits closer to home, it hits harder.
Yes.
Right. And so for a lot of Jewish Americans and Israeli Americans, if they have a closer tie to hostages, then they are going to feel it closer to home in that regard. And similarly, for Palestinian Americans and Muslim Americans, potentially, it would be the same.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think the hope is that somehow, and this is the hope, I believe, that spirituality has the capacity to do this, if we remember that we are all one people, and that hopefully it doesn't have to hit quite so close to home for us to recognize what's going on and to have compassion for each life and to see it as valuable. And I also appreciate what you're saying about the leadership of both of these states, that it is clearly not working and clearly something is really wrong. And so in terms of, you have mentioned, Salem, throughout our conversation, the asterisk of the land, right? The state of Israel. And that is a complicated subject right now. Yeah. And so it would be interesting to hear about your understanding of the sort of idolatry around the state of Israel that you have spoken to before.
Yeah.
Thinking that this state in and of itself is worth worshiping.
Right.
It's not necessarily about the people, and it's the land, and it's, so I would love to hear more about that for our listeners to understand it better.
Yeah. I would say that I think, the state of Israel is, of course, a person-made entity. And in that way, really quite nicely fits into the definition in our Torah of an idol. And, the state of Israel was established in 1948, in a large part by refugees who were fleeing another nationalist project and genocide. Mm-hmm. And when the American Jewish community in particular, that's what I'll mostly speak to, how the American Jewish community views Israel is a lot based on the trauma that came out of pre-war conditions in Europe, namely the Holocaust, the Shoah. Mm-hmm. And, it is a different world today. Israel has become a very, very powerful, very resourced, very heavily armed country that daily controls and oppresses millions of Palestinians who are under its control. And that didn't have to be, but that is definitely where we are right now. And I have spent a lot of time in Israel, in the Palestinian territories. I've never been to Gaza, but in the West Bank, and have witnessed the atrocities that Palestinians deal with every day. And the majority of American Jews, I would say, have not. It is very easy as an American Jew to visit the state of Israel and not see the occupation, not see the apartheid, because the state does everything it can to make that invisible to the average Israeli, to the average tourist, including building walls, literal walls, so that you cannot see certain parts of the West Bank. That is just one thing. So, it is a combination of American Jews not fully understanding what daily life for Palestinians is like. This doesn't, negate the fact that, yes, there are Arab Israelis who have full citizenship. However, they are a minority, and the vast majority of Palestinians are under Israeli military control all of the time. And this was true of Gaza even before Israel invaded after October 7th. Israel didn't have, boots on the ground, but they controlled every aspect of Gaza, as they do the West Bank.
Right.
So what I see in my community is people valuing the state, the fact of a Jewish state, more than they value democracy and equality for all people. Because simply put, right now, it is not a Jewish and democratic state, as so many people want to claim. It can't be when people live under two, vastly different regimes and daily experiences. The Palestinian civilian population is controlled by the Israeli military, while the Israeli civilian population, of course, is governed by Israeli civilian institutions. So what I see is concern for a state more than for the people. And
when you say a state, let's just be really clear. So is it the land, or is it the government, or is it the power? What is it exactly?
I think that's a great question. There are elements of the American Jewish community that will support whatever government is currently in power in Israel. That is becoming, thank God, less and less of a common thing. I would say most people understand that the Netanyahu government is a complete and total moral and political disaster. I think people are very attached to the idea of a Jewish state, which I would like to point out what they mean when they say that is a Jewish army. There are people who, believe that the only way Jews can be safe is if we control our destiny in the form of having more guns than people. That I completely and totally reject that kind of militarism and that vision for how our safety is achieved. The people who believe that are either carrying firsthand, secondhand, thirdhand trauma from people who were very real victims of state violence. Right. So I want to be clear on that.
Totally. So there's a massive amount of generational trauma at work in all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so there's the defense element. And so in some ways, it sounds like the Zionism of the state of Israel is about maintaining the hold and being able to protect themselves so that they are never controlled themselves. Yeah. But then in the process, it's like somebody who's bullied becomes the bully.
Yeah.
And that's happening on the most extreme level that it possibly could.
Yes, with the most advanced weapons and the most money and global support and and yeah. And I know there are many people in the American Jewish community who don't need for Jews to control the whole of the land of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there are, I would say it's extremist to think that the state of Israel should control the whole land, including the current government. But so there is an element of land. And of course, there are particular places in that land, in that state and outside of the state that are particularly holy to Jews and have particular connection, for thousands and thousands of years since the beginning of our religious consciousness.
Yeah.
And so just to answer your question, it is somewhat about the land, but I think there are many people who would be more than happy to have part of that and don't need the whole thing. But it is, I think, ultimately about, quote unquote, self-determination, which in this case,
autonomy.
Yeah, autonomy. I happen to believe that this is why I'm talking to you, is because I believe that a thriving, multiracial, multi-faith democracy ensures safety for Jews in a way that doesn't require us to oppress millions of others.
Right.
But I know that there are people who will say our safety here in this country is only conditional. And I understand that view. I don't agree with it.
And just to clarify for listeners, conditional to what?
That there could arise, right, in this country, another Third Reich. And I think, yes, I do think that is a possibility. I think it is very remote, though. And of course, even during, the Trump administration in 2016 to 2020, there were lots of people who feared what would happen to Jews and others. I want to be clear, and others. And so of course, that possibility is there, but this is why I work every day to try to empower and bolster, democratic institutions, because I think that is where our safety lies.
Yeah.
And, even 2016 to 2020, as horrific as they were, those times were, it was not 1930s Germany. Let's be very clear. Not for Jews anyway. There were cages and camps being built on the border for immigrants.
Right.
So there were elements of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that is playing out in Palestine.
Yes.
Yeah. Which I think is so important to recognize. And I really appreciate what you're saying. And so just to be super clear for all of our listeners, what is your current stance on the situation in Israel and Palestine?
Yeah. The killing has to stop. It absolutely has to. So I have been part of Rabbis for Ceasefire since, October, November, when it started, because I don't believe that there is a military solution to the problems in that region. I am as convinced of it as I am convinced of anything. There's only a diplomatic solution. And as we have seen, the waging of war, if we can call it that, because of course these are not at all equal sides in terms of resources and power, but the continual waging of war by Israel on Gaza has led to tens of thousands of deaths, is only going to lead to more, and has, as we have seen yesterday, has only endangered the hostages. So when I got a lot of pushback when I was calling for ceasefire in November. I went and participated in an action on the Mall in DC with Rabbis for Ceasefire, and encountered absolute vitriol from some of my colleagues and other people that I know. But my position has always been that the way to get the hostages back is through negotiations and diplomacy.
Right.
That we cannot kill our way to getting hostages back, which object lesson we had yesterday.
Right. And just to be super clear for everybody who's listening, depending on when you're listening, I believe at this point there are now 101 hostages.
So.
Is that right?
About that.
Yeah. So, and I think that the idea of a ceasefire is not, okay, let's leave our hostages. No. It's about negotiation. It's about bringing about change. It's about no longer killing anybody.
Yeah.
Nobody.
Yeah.
No more. And I appreciate what you're saying very much.
And I just want to say one more thing, which is that, Gaza was a open air prison before Israel waged its assault on it, by which I mean the military controlled every aspect of what went in and what came out of Gaza. And something like half of Gazans are under 18. So this is when we are talking about a military assault on 2 million Gazans, we are talking about a military assault on 1 million children. And I can't think of anything more reprehensible.
Yeah. I mean, and the stats around how many of those killed have been children is astonishing and horrific. And I think in the same way that a lot of people have seen some of the things happening in the US and are trying to sort of turn away from that, there's a lot of people that are having a hard time even looking at what's going on in Palestine. And we cannot look away. And I think that it's very hard to wrap your head or arms or ideas or thoughts around the idea of, 40,000 plus, probably exponentially more people being killed in Palestine is just very hard to fathom. And it's also something that we have to fathom, so that in every way, each of these people has a family. They have people they are connected to. They likely have very small degrees of separation between their communities and people. And every single one of them is valid and valued and loved and equally worthy of life and care and compassion.
Absolutely.
And so, So thank you.
Yeah. And I want to, I mentioned one hostage in particular whose parents have dual citizenship and who spoke at the DNC. And I want to say, I don't want anything I say to be interpreted as criticism of them, because they are doing what every parent would do, which is use everything in their control, every bit of power they have to try to advocate for their son to come back. And what I know is that every single one of the 40,000 Gazans who have been killed have people who would make the same case for their loved ones. if they had that
Correct.
power. And I'm so grateful that the Goldberg Pollens have the ability to bury their son today and to have a funeral that was flooded with people, because of course he should have that, and they should have the comfort of their community. And every single one of the 40,000 Palestinians who have died should also have that opportunity. And they don't, because they're under assault.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Agreed. And their names are not even known.
Yeah.
For the most part.
Yeah.
Which also makes it less likely that we will connect with them and feel that loss, right? Without names and without faces and, understanding and story, we don't feel as connected to them. And that is one of the big problems, is that we do not, as much as we should and could, feel connected to these losses. So I really feel that. So thank you for sharing that. And so there's so much more for us to talk about sometime. Do you want to ask you one final question? Because I think it's a good one to leave on, and especially because of the conversation that we have just had, because much like politics, the partisanship of politics, there is also partisanship, if you will. There is polarization within the Jewish community around the feelings around Israel and Palestine. And so I'm curious if you have any advice or wisdom from Jewish teachings or your own learning about how to have conversations with people that you don't agree with and how to connect.
Yeah. I'm always looking for a moment to connect. And I do believe, as much criticism as I have for the American Jewish community in this moment, I believe, like I do of all human beings, that, we all want to be living lives where we can thrive and live in safety and give our children better than we have, because I think that's what all human beings want. So I always think there's an opportunity to connect with someone around shared values, because most of us do share the vast majority of values. What we may disagree about is how to get there. So I start with that, assuming good intentions, assuming that we are all human beings and therefore have, as you noted earlier, the divine spark within us, being created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. The other thing I'll say is that from Jewish tradition, we do learn from our texts that it is important to preserve and note minority opinion.
Right. You were saying that earlier.
Yeah, which is a really important thing. When the rabbis were quoting, an opinion that didn't end up holding the day, this was an oral tradition. That meant that the person who was sort of memorizing this had to keep track of more. But the rabbis thought it was so important that this be preserved. So we know that not everyone agreed. And as a lifelong holder of minority opinions, I also understand, a lot of what I've said today on this podcast. I know there are people in my community who would take issue with some of what I've said, particularly around Israel-Palestine. And in our tradition, we understand disagreement as the best kind of disagreement as makloket l'shem shamayim, disagreement for the sake of heaven, which is to say that is the best kind of disagreement. We don't run away from it in Jewish tradition. We know that there's going to be disagreement, right? The aphorism is 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So, that is in our DNA. That is coded in our culture and how we operate. We know there's going to be disagreement, but we also know it is for a purpose, and that we can conduct ourselves with compassion and civility, deep listening, and also recognize, that we do have a larger purpose. And I think that these kind of perspectives help. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that I am calling you from my home in Jackson, Mississippi, which is in the South. And a good friend of mine likes to say that Southerners in particular do intersectionality better than others, because we don't have the opportunity to build our own little silos, which can exist in bigger sort of on the coasts or in big cities. But in the South, especially where, population is more dispersed and there's, large swaths of land and other things that separate us. We have to figure it out. And so I think there is something about being Southern and Jewish that gives me a particular perspective on this, which is that I can't, as I, have been able to in the past in communities that I've lived in DC and Boston and New York, be in my own echo chamber, right? It's very easy for me in some places to be with people who just agree with me. And there is, of course, a comfort and something really wonderful about that too. I don't want to knock that. Yeah. And being here where there are fewer Jews and fewer other types of marginalized folks, we have to figure it out and we have to be together. So, the synagogue that I'm a part of here has people that have all, run the gamut on the spectrum of political beliefs,
Right.
We may agree on a lot of things, but there's going to be some things we definitely don't agree on. And we all figure out how to be together on Friday night in that synagogue because it's literally the only synagogue in town.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So there is something to that as well that I think, my perspective in this particular geographic location.
Yeah. I think there is such an interesting component of Judaism that I really appreciate, which is this idea of valuing disagreement and not like disagreement fighting. Like my sort of vision of, scholars and people studying the Torah and the Talmud and is like these sort of passionate discussions.
Yes.
It's not like yelling at each other. It's having these very deep philosophical conversations. And there's so much curiosity that's embedded in that, which what you're saying also about having these difficult conversations is like, ask the questions, like share your opinions. But if someone doesn't agree with you, that's not the end of the conversation. That's the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily about convincing someone else of your vision. It's about sharing each other's visions and learning and growing from that, however that goes, which I think is really beautiful and such a great vision for how we can connect with people that we don't necessarily agree with.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Thank you for sharing that. Rabbi Salem, I want to thank you immensely for joining us for this exploration. Thank you for sharing your heart with us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you for sharing your own experience and your understanding of the experience of the Jewish people that you can share with us. And I specifically want to say thank you for sharing in this tender time how you're feeling about the Israel-Palestine conflict and what you see is going on. I think it's an essential conversation and something that everybody needs to hear. So I really appreciate you. And to all the listeners, there are a whole bunch of resources in the show notes, including links to important organizations that Salem has worked with, but also that she recommends that you check out, that are all related to the Israeli-Palestine conflict and much more. So I hope that you will check that out. And if you have questions, you can reach Rabbi Salem. Her website is also in the show notes. And you can reach me. My information is in the show notes. You can always reach out to me at www.theconnectedway.com or send me a DM or comment on anything that's on Instagram. And I'm here. So I know this is a tender topic. I know that it can bring up a lot for people and there's a lot of opinions and feelings about it. So I hope that this has been informative and helpful. And if you need anything or want to share your thoughts, please share. Thanks so much, everybody. See you soon. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Connected Way. You can find all the resources mentioned in the show and even more resources in the show notes and on the podcast page at theconnectedway.com/podcast. Before you go, a note about sponsorship. This podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and the work of The Connected Way, enhancing individual and collective connection to self, others, the land, and spirituality, you can donate on the podcast webpage. There is never any pressure or expectation, but if you feel called to support the work, any contribution of any amount helps, as do your good thoughts. And finally, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaway from today's show. What inspired you? What surprised you or made you think? Let me know by posting a comment on any of the posts or DMing me on Instagram, or of course, you can always send me a message on the website. Thanks again for being here, friends. May this podcast bring more connection to you and the collective. And so it is. See you next time.